You are listening to Afro Becky.
Can you speak up some?
They need to listen. You are listening to Afro Becky, one of your hosts of the Black Law Legalized podcast team.
Yes, and my name is Dan, aka Dan on Drugs. You can catch me on Twitter and on IG at I am Dan on Drugs. Keep up with the show on all social media platforms at Black Law Podcast.
Yeah, and you ain't catching me nowhere, cause see, I know how to get away from the police. My name's just Dan, and that was just real. I can't escape the popos because I know all the ins and outs and the duck offs and the hideaways.
You
And
just
can
grease their
follow me.
palms. You're rich.
And you can follow me on Twitter at I Tell Legal Lies. And shout out to all the people who liked this updated profile pic.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I wanted to specifically talk about a serious subject. Now, in many episodes, we have briefly mentioned certain aspects of domestic violence and things of that nature, but we've never really taken a look at the different types of protective orders, because I think the word restraining order is almost like a catch-all to multiple types of orders. Am I incorrect in saying that?
Yes and no. Protective orders would be the legal terminology, I guess you would. But they can be used interchangeably.
So when people hear restraining order, this is what I'm speaking from the average Joe standpoint is: you can't come around me. You can't contact me. You got to stay within 500 feet of me or whatever it is. And if you violate that protective order, I can call the police and you will be arrested and you'll go to jail. Ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that that's not how it works. And I don't know shit about the legal side, but I do know shit about people violating these protective orders and the police being called, and the said person is no longer in the vicinity, nothing happens. I'm not sure if that's the same everywhere, but back home, that was the case. So if Ann has a protective order against me, I show up on her job, calls a scene, she calls the cops, I jump in my car and leave before the cops get there, unless there's hardcore proof, like such as surveillance or Ann snapped a picture. Even eyewitnesses might be kind of shaky.
Well, as far as that is concerned, if you have eyewitnesses, technically they could be used to show that you are in violation of the protective order. That is honestly how a lot of people get around protective orders. And I believe I've said this before, but it bears repeating. Just because you get any sort of protective order against someone, if you have gone off the deep end to the point that someone has to get a protective order against you, more than likely you are not going to follow. I believe I said in a recent episode that if you're a criminal, you're not going to obey the law anyway. So what's the most that can happen if you violate a protective order? You go to jail
For 24 hours maybe.
Or sometimes you may be slapped with a fine. Or so it's like, depending on the reason why the protective order was given and whether or not that thing is temporary or permanent, what have you, what you could face for violating that varies as well. So for most people, okay, I violated this order. And as you said earlier, can you prove it? And it's like, you're not supposed to be at my house. And I come and I ring your doorbell. I show up, or I'm outside, sit in my car at your house. And you call the cops. When they get there, you're not there. what can they do? You can file a report. Now, I know of instances where this has happened. Like, people have violated protective orders time and time and time and time again. The people have actually called the police, and it's all documented. Fast forward, the person is no longer alive, and the assailant who's had this protective order is now in jail.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that I know personally one person that happened to. She's no longer with us because, in spite of the fact that she had gotten this protective order against her boyfriend, he kept violating it. And they had a child together. So, you know, he wasn't supposed to come around. They had arranged visitation through some surrogates. You know, she would drive the little boy to his mother's house, and the mother would in turn take the child wherever the father was. I mean, she did everything right. You know, every time he violated, she documented. And in the end, she's dead. The little boy is motherless, and he's basically fatherless as well, because this guy is now in Angola because he killed her. And like I said, if you do a Google search,
We covered a story
something
maybe
like that.
about a year and a half or so ago where same thing, woman called the police department, and to paraphrase, I don't even know what episode it was because it was a sidebar, but to paraphrase, the police basically told her to stop calling us. Stop calling us.
Yep.
And
I
then
remember
they
that.
stopped responding to her calls. Finally, the dude showed up, killed her. She was actually on the phone with the 911 operator. I believe this was in Texas. And she got killed while on the phone with the 911 operator. There was a protective order in place there. So I guess, well, my first question is going to be, how effective are protective orders?
See, and that is what I alluded to at the top of the show.
Yeah, you did.
If you have somebody who is not afraid of law enforcement, how effective is a protective order
Right.
going
But
to be?
I guess I'm speaking in general as a whole.
Well,
Like, if we could go percentage wise, are they 50%
say
effective?
this is not my I say this is not my area of law, but
Yeah, family law. You know?
no, honestly, in family law cases, you get protective orders all the time, but not necessarily when we get like temporary restraining orders. They're not to keep someone away from someone. They are to keep someone from selling or divesting themselves of community property. So,
Explain.
all right. So, if you have community property,
Louisiana is like one of 3 states.
it's not 3, it's about 5. Thank you.
Same difference.
Not. Okay, so if you are in a community property state, and if you're not in a community property state, because if you're not in a community property state, you are in the state where if you buy something together, you are equal owners. You can't sell your part, but you can sell the whole. So in Louisiana, if it's community property, you can't sell because you have what's called an undivided 1/2 interest. Meaning, like I said, you can't sell your half, but you can sell the whole thing. Or if you have a bank account that has both of your names on it, you can go and take all the
Clean that
money
bitch
out.
Yeah.
So what happens in a situation where you file for divorce, or you file and you're waiting for a final order or judgment of divorce, you get a restraining order to stop the other person from getting rid of that property. So you can't go to the bank and take all the money out. You can't go, like, if you have stock, you can't do that. You don't want, until there's been what's called a partition, which is a separation of the body of the things that are in the community. Till there's been that, you can't do anything to those community assets.
Now, let me ask you this too. As an attorney,
Hmm?
what are your thoughts on community property versus how every other state?
See, it's kind of weird because
When a
it's
nigga
almost
start off with a,
well, no, because people always ask about Louisiana and the way Louisiana law works. Honestly, it's almost the exact same way. Like if you're what's called tenants in common, meaning you and someone else own something together, the law almost works the exact same way as community property. One exception though is how
it's obtained.
well, not necessarily how it's obtained, because in community property, anything you buy after you get married considered community because it's purchased with community funds.
Okay, so what if you don't commingle funds? It's still community
Right.
funds. Okay.
Anything, if you are married in the state of Louisiana, you get married in the state of Louisiana, your income from the moment that they pronounce you husband and wife, you're married, anything that you work for, that is considered community property. So a half of it is for your wife or your husband, so your spouse. So
And the
anything that
same can be said for other states, but just in a different.
Well-
because let me just real quick jump in and say that I know in one of my father's many divorces, he didn't have to give up half of shit because his wife was a homemaker, I guess, or a stay-at-home mom.
Mhm.
He didn't have to give up half of anything other than. Now I don't know if this was court mandated or by choice, but he gave up like
Stuff
a
that he-
third of his retirement.
because that's how much had vested during the time that they were married. So saying that, unlike other states, when you get married, your income is not considered, half of your income is not considered the other
Community.
spouse.
Okay.
So that's how much had vested during the time that they were married. So saying that, unlike other states, when you get married, your income is not considered, half of your income is not considered the other
Community.
spouse.
Okay.
So but what you all buy together, you all co-own. You are what's called, like I said earlier, tenants in common.
Okay. Last thing before we jump back into the protective orders
Right.
is okay, you're married in Louisiana,
Mhm.
community property state
Mhm.
or whatever any of the others are.
Mhm.
You move to a state that's not a community property state.
Mhm.
Okay. So now what? Because you were technically married in Louisiana, now you're no longer living in Louisiana. Are you bound by the new state's laws?
Well, if you change your residency.
Okay.
Which you most likely would.
Will,
Yeah.
right. So you move out of the state of Louisiana. Anything that was considered community property when you were a resident and living in the state of Louisiana is still affected. If it's a home that you didn't sell or whatever, it's still affected by the laws of the state of Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
So anything that you accumulate from the time that you enter into this other state and you take up residence in this other state, you start buying things. Louisiana law doesn't affect that because
Okay,
you're now in this other state and you are a resident of this other state. But having said that, if you are from another state,
That's where I was going. Let's buy some investment property in Louisiana.
well, no, if you're from another state and you move, that is not a community property state, and you move into the state of Louisiana, you have a certain period of time to
1
opt
year.
out
1 year.
of the community property law or, community
Mhm.
property. And if you don't,
Then you become. So why can't you opt out? You know what? That's a whole different episode.
Yeah, I think we'll save that for later.
Yeah.
Put
well, you
that in
can't
your
opt out
pocket.
of community property in the state of Louisiana.
with
You
a
cannot-
SPA.
You can opt out
With a SPA.
with you.
Okay. Back to the protective orders.
Right. So we got into protective order because when you see, and that's why I said restraining orders are not created
family
equal,
law,
because there are restraining orders. There are restraining orders that stop you from getting rid of property. So protective orders, if that's what we're talking about, that's a different animal. And when we talk about protective orders, we're talking about orders that stop you from harming someone else. So they are also called restraining orders, and they can be temporary, they can be permanent,
emergency.
right?
So here's what I'm looking at is womenslaw.org, and some of the types of protective orders Louisiana offers. Stalking protective orders.
Yep.
Sexual assault protective orders.
Yeah.
Moving to another state with a violence protective order. So I guess there's a violence protective order. And then enforcing, this isn't a type, but it goes on to tell you how to enforce an out-of-state protective order.
Right. You have to make that executor in the state of Louisiana. Now,
let's start at the top. Stalking. Stalking protective orders. So who can get a stalking protective order? Louisiana allows a victim of stalking or cyber stalking.
I was about to ask if that's included.
Right.
For a protective order, even if the person is not a family, household member, or a dating partner.
You know that cyber stalking thing, as far as Louisiana goes, is fairly new.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have laws about cyber stalking on the books. Like I said, it's fairly recent. It's something that happened.
LA
correct me. I think it's like
statute.
2008 or something like that. It's not been like a very long time that we've had like cyber stalking on the books.
Yeah, it's LA Revised Statute 46-2173. If anybody wants to look that up.
Yeah,
I don't even know what that means.
Right.
Yeah, but one of the things here that I wanted to point out is you do not have to be arrested. The person that you're getting a protective order against, let's say they threaten you, they're stalking you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That person does not have to be arrested
for you to get the order.
So right now, I can actually go down to the courthouse and get a protective order of Ann, because I'm sure throughout the course of this podcast, I've been threatened many times.
But you have
on audio recording.
To show cause. Like you can't see, and that's the thing. When people try to abuse the system, it used to be. It's kind of harder now. Back in the day, it was easy for a woman to go and walk into a police station and say, this person is X, Y, and Z-ing me, and yada yada yada, and get a protective order. These days, you have to have evidence, and it has to be convincing. You have to show like a body of text messages or emails. You have to have somebody that's able to corroborate. It's not as easy to just walk in and say, hey, I need an order against X, Y, and Z. I myself have actually gotten a protective order against someone.
Okay.
Former client?
No, former client's spouse.
Well, and then that's two. I never told y'all about, it was a domestic abuse situation.
Where the dude followed you home from court?
No, that's the one, the courthouse. Yeah.
Okay.
That's one. The other one, was actually someone that I was involved with, and I had to get a protective order.
Would Cheese go with his name?
Huh?
Would Cheese go with his name?
Maybe.
Huh. Interesting. We're going to talk about that all night. Because, Ann is known for lunatics are her thing. Lunatics are her thing.
Y'all can't tell.
Yeah. Well, now I want to say something very unpopular here. So you talk about how the women could abuse the court system with these restraining orders, right? I've known several women, and of course I don't mean all women or even majority. I've known several women who have threatened men with child support. And with this whole Me Too movement, right? You know, at first I'm thinking this is a great thing. We're outing a lot of these predators or these dudes with this predatorial behavior. People like the Weinsteins, the Cosbys.
But now it's becoming abusive.
Yes. Now it's like,
and now you're guilty
no matter what.
Right.
Like there's this comedian.
Just the accusation.
What's his name? Aziz Ansari.
Mm-hmm.
He got accused of. Now I don't know what happened, but there was her version of what happened, and there was his version of what happened. And he straight up apologized. He was like, "I'm sorry if it came off this way, or if that's how you viewed what happened that night, but that's not, in my eyes, what happened. It didn't matter because now everyone's looking at him like he's a fucking scumbag."
Right. Like I said, the result, and I get where you're coming from, because the result of Me Too, it was a great moment. But as we said with these protective orders, it's easy to abuse. And with the emotions behind the whole Me Too movement, it's because women repressed this for so long till now was as soon as you were accused, you were guilty until proven innocent.
Right.
You know, so, but it's because the voices were suppressed for so long. Now everybody was like, and then too, as with anything, and it's not just this, but as with anything, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
So these women were like, oh, all I have to do is accuse him and that's dude is going down.
But now let me tell you though, here is something that I've been kicking around. So I'm about to think out loud because this thought is not fully complete. Okay. White woman gets on Me Too, Me Too, Me Too. Okay. Black woman gets on Me Too, Me Too, Me Too.
Me Too started by a black woman, by the way.
Yes.
Yes. And I think Alyssa Milano is the one that like
blew her up. Yeah. Right.
But regardless, so black woman, okay, Puerto Rican woman, Me Too, I was Me Too, I was Me. Black people as a whole, we have been voicing our grievances for decades, half a century, and no one has gotten behind us. Black women have been, they've been voicing
that exact same thing.
It's like,
but then here you have this contingent of white women who came out and
exactly
said,
what it is. It is
rich,
because,
by the way,
not even rich. It's because white women got involved. Because without, and we talk about this often, we talk about white backers, basically, or white people backing movements, so to speak. So they don't want to get behind us and our racial injustices
because white people give it legitimacy.
Right.
It's basically, if someone white can look at your cause and say,
how can I benefit from that, basically?
Mm-hmm. You're right. Well, let's, you know what? That is an injustice. Let's make this happen. So, and you're absolutely right. And that is we've discussed that before.
Yeah.
It's
multiple times.
Right. It's the power of the white voice. Black people and brown people, people of color, have been marginalized forever. And if we are angry about something, especially black women, honestly, you know, angry black men seem threatening.
Angry black women normal.
Well, angry black women, we just have an axe to grind. You know, we're not really saying anything, and there's not really an injustice that we're angry about. We're just angry, period.
All the time, yeah.
You know, that is what the projection of black women.
So check this out. Have you seen the recent with Michael Vick?
No.
Okay, so the NFL is doing something with Michael Vick. I don't know if it's Hall of Fame. I don't know what it is, but the NFL is doing something.
Hold on, tell me the white people mad about
back
this.
on these dogs, right?
Oh my God.
So it's like, how dare he be able to make a living? How dare he be able to do this and that because the dog? Michael Vick went to prison. Michael Vick served time. Michael Vick was not running that dog ring. Michael Vick's people were at his property. That shit was like in Virginia somewhere. Michael Vick played for the Atlanta Falcons and stayed in Atlanta most of the time. But here nor there, like these people will not let him. But yet we have other people like Ben Roethlisberger, who's been accused of rape multiple times. We have who else? There's a couple others. The punter, the kicker that beats the shit out of his wife. Nah, they're good. They're cool. But Michael Vick, even Ray Rice, he deserves a second chance. He knocked his girlfriend out in the elevator. He deserves a second chance. But don't, like that new Netflix series, Don't Fuck with Cats. Don't fuck with dogs because, man.
Well, you know what? And I'm an animal person. I'm a dog lover.
Me too. I love cats and dogs.
Right. So, but that is just for me indicative of it. When that whole thing with Michael Vick happened, I actually that gave me a reason to pause. And I smiled, but I was not smiling because it was an enjoyable feeling. I smiled, and my smile was filled with, are you serious? Because there are black people out here dying at the hands of white cops almost on a daily basis, and y'all got enraged by dogs being in a dog fighting ring. That enraged you, but at the same time, juxtaposition, you see these black men being gunned down and nobody said anything.
Shouldn't have resisted. That's what they said.
Nobody said anything. And so I'm sitting up here like, y'all gotta be kidding me.
Yeah.
This is what you were enraged about. You were enraged. And like I said, I'm an animal lover. I was ticked off by what was going on. I hate dog fighting. I do.
Let me tell you, I'm gonna jump in here to another thing. Pit bulls, for those of you unfamiliar. Sure, they are sweet dogs. I've owned pit bulls in my life, and sweet dogs towards humans. They kind of are dog aggressive. You have certain breeds that are dog aggressive, but pit bulls were bred to fight. So not to justify having a dog fighting ring, but those dogs were doing what they do. And that's like cockfighting. That's big in the South. I never even heard of it until I moved down here. And they put like these little razor blades and shit on the chicken's fingers, and they be like clawing each other.
Yeah, but that's also popular in like the Caribbean. So
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet. So anyway, that just goes to show that.
But
that animals, we can't say on topic.
We are on topic.
No,
with
we are
protective orders.
Yeah, we are, because we're talking about
how they were easy to abuse
and how basically animals are worth more than people of color.
Exactly.
No matter what kind of animal.
So can you get a protective order against an animal?
Well, now that you say that, I have this. This is my last thought on the subject. Is I've known situations where kids were grossly abused, and I'm talking about by biological parents, by aunts, uncles, whatever. These abuses were reported. These kids remained in these abusive houses. I also know of dogs, because I reported one of these dogs that was being abused, and they came out the next day and took the dog. So I'm like, yo, that I mean,
right.
That speaks to a lot.
Our society is chopped and screwed. It really is. But it goes back to the value that you place on people, as opposed to other things, and especially people of color. So, my dog can live the high life. A black person or a brown person
cannot,
or a yellow person cannot.
Here, let's do this here. We're in wrapping up. How do you get a protective order against a domestic partner or somebody stalking you? Any of them? How do you get it?
Okay, so you start out filing a police report. So you would go into your nearest police station, bringing what evidence you have. Now, what normally happens in domestic situations is there's a fight or there's an argument, some sort of physical or altercation. And back in the day, it used to be there was a male and a female, there was a physical altercation. Police was called, the man is taken out of the home.
Virginia did 3 to 7 days. You had to, like that happened to my father as well. His wife at the time attacked him. He defended himself. There's all kinds of eyewitnesses and all.
And he was taken out.
Still was like, they didn't take him to jail, but you have to leave the house for, I think it was 3 or 7 days. And so he had to go stay with my grandmother.
Right. So, but now though, surprisingly, that this is once again rather new. I know for a very long time in the city of New Orleans, when it was domestic call, police came out, both people were actually taken and, brought to the police station. And it was like, you want to file charges against her? You want to file charges against him? That was like restraining orders on both in relation to the other person. And for a long time, I don't know if that's still the case. It's been a while since I've even checked to see like what's going on with that. But that would basically be the situation. And I know in my situation, person is taken away, you go down, you
Did he at least punch you in the face?
No.
Damn.
Like I say, you file this order, they tell you to stay away, you have to go to court. And that's a big thing. By the time it comes to you actually going to court,
You could be dead.
1, 2, most women, if this is the male that's actually taken out of the home and the order is against them, most women don't show up in court and they get remorseful and they call the district attorney and it's like,
try to drop the charges.
Right.
But check this. So I was reading too about the emergency. So basically with an emergency protective order, that shit
Straight
is
to the court.
effective right
Immediately,
now.
right.
But you have to show up to court in order for it to become a temporary or permanent. But
Right.
an emergency is like right now. Yeah.
Right. And so the process is you file the report, it gets sent to the district attorney, goes to court, judge gives a temporary, and you have a certain period of time to make that thing permanent. And you have to show up in court. You have to give them evidence to show why the order should remain in place. So, and especially in a domestic situation, if there is like a history of abuse in the home, there's something that we have, which is like Uniform Domestic Abuse Act. And that is what helps if you're going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. That helps you make these out-of-state orders, protective orders, executory in the state that you've moved to. So, and there's supposed to be like a database, even though I don't know how up to date it's kept. There's actually supposed to be a database where they put these things in so that, you can track this stuff. Now, like I said, I don't know how this thing is maintained, if it's actually up to date as it should be. But when that Uniform Act was created, that database was also created and it should still be active. But so police, district attorney, court, judge signs the order,
Boom.
certain amount of time. But let me just say, as I was saying earlier, something that, and we've mentioned the mentality behind, or the mentality that an abuse victim has. So often than not, I've seen people get temporary protective orders, But when it comes time to make those things permanent, they're pleading to drop charges. But something that can be said about that is the city or the state or the county can pick those up, because charges like that, those are things that a county or a parish or a state actually has an interest in, the protection of its people. And even though you yourself may no longer want to maintain these charges, the state can go forward with it if they know that this person has a history of violence and abuse.
We've
So
seen that multiple times here. So let me end with this. A few episodes ago, when we were talking about domestic violence, we got an email from Ben. So I talked to Ben and I asked if it was okay that I share the email with our listenership. So it goes. Hey guys, just started listening to the podcast. Really like what you do. Great job. Keep up the good work. I wanted to write in because of the episode You Willing to Die, particularly about the psyche of abuse victims and the common question, why don't they just leave? This is often misunderstood, and it sounded like you'd be open to learning about it. For context, I have been a registered nurse for 10 plus years, worked in an emergency department for the last 7, so I know a lot about abuse and victims of abuse, so I might be able to lend some perspective. First, we need to separate the idea of child abuse from domestic abuse. Although similar, it is a very different dynamic psychology. Let's start with the common occurrence, the woman in an abusive relationship. First thing to know is that relationships that are abusive do not start abusive. In fact, it is often over time, like over the top, romantic, too good to be true, etc. You brought up a circumstance in which you would express displeasure in how a woman was dressed, and she told you to pound sand. This is why it starts nicely, because women are much more confident in standing up for themselves and will not hesitate to leave someone who is being an asshole. Early in a relationship, it is easy to cut ties and move forward. If it gets physical, they are able to think rationally in this moment, and they will leave the relationship as a matter of survival. Abusers pick up on this, and the goal is, whether subconscious or conscious, early in the relationship, to provide the woman with a perfect relationship. You'll see this in a lot of interviews with battered women, how the man conforms to their idea of a perfect mate and they quickly fall in love with them. This is the honeymoon stage and is in place to establish trust and love, essentially to hook them in. It's full of romantic acts, compliments, gifts, thoughtful behaviors, etc. It is so overwhelming how this seemingly perfect man just fell out of the sky. So they move forward with a commitment. They move in together, start talking about marriage. They make big purchases together, maybe start a joint banking account. From the woman's point of view, she is establishing a long-term commitment. From the abuser's point of view, he is trying to exert as much control as possible, as stealthily as possible.
Right.
He tries to get their money intertwined, tries to control her housing and transportation,
Correct.
may even try to find a new apartment that is conveniently away from nearby friends. This is where the seed is planted. And the abuser manipulates the woman into believing that this is all in her best interest. Everything he does has an explanation, and the really manipulative ones don't need to say it. They're so good. They're able to get the woman to come to these conclusions on their own.
Voluntarily, right.
And it comes a day when he locks it all down and proposes to her. Not all abusive relationships begin or result in marriage, but it's not uncommon that in the process, the man will try to marry or procreate with her to make it even harder
More
to
control,
terminate
right.
the relationship. It's around this time that things start to slip. Maybe starts with reprimanding her for doing something that he didn't like, or dressing in a way that he considers slutty. he becomes more firm in his conviction and may even raise his voice or start with name calling. It's usually over something seemingly inconsequential. After the confrontation, he'll immediately apologize to her for his temper and explain why his actions were justified, but promises that it'll never happen again. Usually it's, I only said that because I love you so much and didn't want to lose you. Or he'll blame it on being drunk or some past experience that left him jaded. It's all bullshit. But it's in a way that you would be able to make sense of it. It starts with small issues that don't seem important because the woman is more likely to just let it go. What's the matter, really? He's a nice guy. Good people make mistakes, etc. Well, those small issues continue to snowball. In between confrontations, he goes back to the honeymoon phase and overcompensates affection to show that it really was just a mistake. And he wasn't a bad guy after all. The more this happens, the more times he repeats why he acted the way he did, the woman will start to justify it herself in her head before he does. As this goes on, he just stops justifying his action. He doesn't need to because she does the work for him. And she knows that affectionate reward is soon to follow. At this point, some women will try to leave, but the man will come back with lofty promises and affection, and the woman is convinced that he is able to change and able to become the man that he was when she met him. Man, this goes on for another few paragraphs, so just skip to the bottom. Why don't they just call the police? This is talking about he was talking about being in the ER, women coming in the ER. They don't even give them phone numbers anymore to help because the dude might find it and beat her ass again.
Right.
So why don't they just call the police? Well, keep in mind, she thinks her life could be ended by notifying anybody. Calling the police might get him into the record, but she may refuse to press charges, as Ann said earlier, because she fears for her life. If he is taken to jail, he will likely bail himself out, and the first thing he's going to do is find her. What about a restraining order? That's just one piece of paper, not armor. If she calls protective services, her kids may be taken away. If she leaves the state, she leaves behind all of her family and friends, and even
That's correct.
That doesn't guarantee that he won't find her. She, in fact, believes that he will always be 2 steps ahead of her because he has led her to believe that he always is. It's not a matter of just leave, because there is nowhere to go that he won't be, in her mind at least.
Right.
Compound that with the further rock bottom self-esteem and embarrassment for letting it come to this, to the point that she legitimately believes she deserves this, as well as holding on to what she thought the relationship could be one day. This is why they stay. Some women come from families with history of domestic violence, and they'll see this as a necessary part of a union, and that's kind of scary in its own.
Yeah, it is. It's sad.
That is actually everything that Ben said. We covered in that. We said that ourselves because just background, we've seen it.
Yeah.
And these are things, and we've said that everything is cyclical. So if you think about it, if I am in a situation where I've seen my mom and dad constantly being in fight, my dad constantly abusing my mother, when I get to an age where I'm now in a relationship,
that means he loves me.
Exactly. More often than not everybody in the world, but as I said, more often than not, what you see are women who actually fall in exactly these kind of relationships, in spite of the fact that you've said to yourself, I am not going to wind up like my mother, or I'm not going to be an abuser like my father. We are creatures of our environments and our genetics. So
So does that mean that men can have it in their genes to beat women?
No, it's
I got something in my genes to beat a woman with.
When I say our environment and our genes, like people are predisposed to being addicted to things.
Right.
Or a
that,
dick.
That's genetic. But you don't necessarily have to be or have someone in your family that's an addict to become an addict.
Right.
So you're either, you're a creature of your environment and your genetics. So even if you never saw someone being abused, you can still turn into an abuser.
Absolutely. So go check out You Willing to Die. That's a previous episode. We covered that. This has been another episode. Hopefully you guys learned something, walk away with something useful this week.
Right. Because even though you have protective orders, don't rely on that piece of paper. That Ben said that, and I'm going to second that because, as I said, if this person that you got this order against is predisposed to beating you, a piece of paper is not going to stop them.
Exactly. My name is Dan. You can keep up with me on Twitter and on IG at I am Dan on Drugs. Follow the show across all social media platforms at Black Law Podcast. And shout out to Ben. Thanks for the email.
Yes.
Well written, and we really appreciate your insight.
Sir.
Yeah, we did learn something.
Yeah, and I'm Just Dan, and you can follow me on Twitter at I Tell Legal Lies.
And this is Afro Becky signing off.
Peace.